Hello and welcome back to Melone Hatley's podcast, Season 2, I Now Pronounce You Divorce. Today we have a guest with us who has military experience, and we're going to be talking about how that helped him through his career, and in more particular, kind of how it shapes his advice to clients along the way that are dealing with military issues, going through any type of divorce or separation. So, Lelan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan, for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, we're excited to get started too. And for those tuning in, Leland was a guest on season 1, and he's our litigation attorney out of Fort Worth who opened and started that office for us. So he's back again, and we're super excited. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I was trying to narrow my question. So how has deployment and relocations, we're just going to kick it off, how does that complicate custody?
Yeah, so normally the military is going to have soldiers, active duty soldiers, or deploying soldiers if they're not married or they have children outside of their marriage or they just have children. They're going to ask them to prepare what we call a family safety plan. And so essentially that normally happens if they're active duty, they have to have that before they're allowed to join. And then, as life happens and people divorce, the military is going to really want them to prepare that. And essentially what that family safety plan is going to do is kind of outline what's supposed to happen in times of deployment, separation, those sorts of things. So it's really difficult, right? There's also some provisions in the Texas Family Code specifically that deal with that. As an example, you can appoint in Texas someone of your choice to basically take your time, your visitation time, if you're on military orders and deployment. So I do a lot of decrees. I very rarely see those provisions. So every time I get an active military member involved, that's definitely something I tell them. At a very minimum, I can make sure that your mother, your wife, your father, your grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle can still visit with the children in your absence. So if you're getting, as an example, first, third, and fifth weekend, well, then we can make sure those visits still happen with the paternal or the maternal family, whomever my client is, while you're deployed. So, yeah, it can be really difficult, especially on kids, but there's definitely things in place in Texas and the family code that we can add to a decree to make sure that the kids are still being able to visit with that side of the family.
You raise an interesting point to where the protections potentially expand beyond just the immediate family. Is that challenging to do in Texas to ensure that grandma or grandpa or aunt or uncle are able to spend some form of quality time with the kids while the other parent is deployed?
Well, I mean, when you say difficult to do, I would say that that's probably one of the most common issues that we see with military, active military, is that I guess the non-client, from our perspective, that side of the family kind of feels like they have possession over the child and they don't really want anybody else involved, right? And sometimes a service member, they may all be from Texas, let's say, in this area, and service member goes to Virginia. Well, mom here locally probably doesn't want grandma and grandpa really having any hold on the child. And unless the military member is deployed or on military orders, there's no real requirement that they would. But if they did deploy or go on military orders, i.e. Iraq, those people would be able to take a stake. So yes, it can be difficult from that sense. But fortunately for us, I would say that our judges in Texas are pretty military friendly as a general rule, and they understand the code. So most judges are going to follow the family code, and family code has pretty express provisions in there. It's not a can, it's a shall, right? And so I think that, we get that put into decrees if we want it, and there's not really much fight to it because the courts know and everybody knows that it's not the service member's fault that they had to deploy, and it's good for the child to visit with that side of the family.
Could there be a situation to where someone deploys but does not have a family care plan in place, or does that have to happen before deployment?
It's really rare. I mean, I guess it could be possible if the military wasn't aware of what was going on. But I mean, as a former military member that deployed 3 times to Iraq in a very short time frame, and I was married for the second 2, and I had children on my third one, the deployment process with the military is pretty intense. I mean, it's weeks of vaccinations and paperwork, and I know that we're going to probably try to talk about the survivor benefit in a little bit, They make sure you update your survivor benefits, powers of attorney. I get a pretty extensive process that the military's kind of refined and updated and fixed over the years and years and years of deployment. So it very rare. I mean, there's like a checklist for leadership, and so that's one of the things that we make sure of. And so, yeah, I would say it very rarely happens where there's not something in place. But I mean, you have situations where a service member could be married and happily married, deploy, right, and their husband is going to take care of the children. And while the service members in Iraq, they decide they're going to Alaska or home or wherever they choose to move, and they just pick up and move the entire family. So in that situation, the service member couldn't possibly have planned for something like that to happen.
Sure. And once you have a family care plan in place, can those be modified, or do we have to wait for the deployment to be over?
Yeah, they absolutely can be modified. The military uses Red Cross a lot. So when things happen in your life, i.e., serious things like you have a child that's in a serious car accident and you don't know if they're going to make it, right? The Red Cross is going to reach out to the service member and they're probably going to catch a flight home and they're going to be able to deal with that. Or, this situation where maybe a spouse were to die, you were there, you went to a deployment, your spouse died, so your children essentially don't have anyone there. They're going to send that service member home to come take care of the children. And that might be true even if the service member didn't have primary custody, right? Let's say that dad had primary custody in Texas, service members in Virginia deployed to Iraq, dad in Texas dies in a car accident. The military would probably send service member home and have those children relocated to Virginia. And so essentially that would be kind of how that goes. But the military is pretty in tune with those sorts of things, and the Red Cross. And when you're in it's the military. It's something that's definitely very well communicated amongst the people in the military. So everybody, mothers, fathers, grandmas, grandpas, aunts, uncles, everybody understands the process when something like that might happen.
Right. Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And, one, thank you for your service. And then two, how has your experience shaped the way that you approach any issue in family law as you represent your clients?
Yeah. So I actually, just to get a little personal here, I actually was, I joined out of high school right when I got high school. I joined the Army and, went through a deployment and then got married, had children young. Everybody in the military is married and has children, especially on the enlisted side. It's just like normal. And so I did all of that, and obviously, it didn't work out. And so then right when I was processing out of the military, I was going through a divorce, custody situation, relocation, all the things that we typically see in a military situation. So because of my personal experiences, I like to bring those into, and not only military divorces, but specifically military divorces. I can really relate to those experiences and kind of tell my own personal story in a way to try to impart some wisdom on the service members to what they might be looking forward, some of the things and hurdles that I worked through and found that I didn't know were gonna be issues. And so it's just a great advantage for me to be able to give that back to military members and kind of mentor them a little bit. Because I was, as most of these people, I was literally sitting in, like what do they say? I walked down the same road, but maybe not in the same shoes.
And that's so important that you have that ability to relate to the clients and fully understand what they're communicating to you and not just trying to understand. So I think that probably does translate well and how you zealously advocate for your clients. You mentioned something earlier on in this podcast that's so important, but yet a lot of people have so many questions on, and that's survivor benefits. Can you maybe break that down, and what is it and how important are they?
Yeah, so I mean, the big one I think is the SGLI Service Group Life Insurance Policy. When I was deploying, it was over $400,000, and that was, I mean, I don't want to show my age, but that was a long time ago. So I have I'm not 100% sure what it is like as we sit here today, but it was a lot of money. And so depending on the spouse, and depending on what's going on, those are benefits that, obviously the service member elects a beneficiary, whether that be the spouse, the current spouse, the children, the grandma or grandpa, whomever it might be. And then also when we're going through a divorce to military spouses, that can also be something that we use as leverage, whether you're on the pro military side or the anti, in that, if there's a child support obligation or something like that, a lot of times you might try to leverage some benefit of that survivor benefit to cover any outstanding child support should something happen to the service member. So that's definitely something that will come in when we're divorcing for sure.
You mentioned child support. What factors are taken in consideration for child support besides just actual income when you're dealing with a service member?
Well, so something obviously with the military, we have travel and potentially relocation. There are some provisions in the Texas Family Code. So in Texas, we do what we call a guideline child support calculation. It's governed by Chapter 154 of the Texas Family Code. And so with that, it's pretty much universal. The judge just looks at the code and assigns the thing. There's some provisions in there, and I'm sure most states have other provisions or similar provisions, where you can deviate from the standard calculation of child support for distance and things like that. So as military service members travel and it becomes more and more expensive to have the visitation, of course, we can request the judges to deviate from that guideline to reduce the amount of child support so that the service member will be able to actually visit the children and it won't eat, not only the child support obligation, which is a percentage, but then in addition to. And then obviously there's provisions like traveling, like, can we meet mutual halfway? Are we going to, can we exchange at an airport? Unaccompanied minors when people are flying on the airlines. What does that look like? What age does it need to happen? Who drops off and who picks up? So that's something definitely we can benefit the service members to as they continue to transition in life and move from, PCS from post to post. It's definitely something that I think is necessary so that they can protect their rights to visit with the child as they continue to be, great members of our military.
You mentioned PCS. For those who are tuning in, can you elaborate on what that stands for?
Yeah, so it's just basically when you transfer from base to base. So ETS would be exiting the military or getting out. PCS would basically be going from base to base, transferring duty stations orders.
We've had a lot of questions come in on the child support and along the lines of my branch that I'm in, they have a certain threshold requirement for child support. Then if I go and talk to an attorney, it's different. Why is that?
So I don't know specifically what they're saying, but there's two types of payments that service members get when they're married. That's BAS, which is like a food allowance, and BAH, which is a housing allowance. Okay, so frequently when people are going through divorce, something that non-service members like to do is contact the chain of command of the service member and say, hey, my husband or wife is not providing you with any financial support, right? Let's use the Texas to Virginia example. They've moved to Virginia. I'm still here in Texas. They decided they want to divorce me and they're not helping me out at all. So in cases like that, the command can kind of determine and decide how much that service member needs to give the spouse. And that's not going to be subject to any laws, right? That's not going to be any kind of calculation. That's just going to be some commander saying, I think you're going to give her X. Go down to S1 right now, put in a thing to make sure that you're transferring that to her account or else, right? And so that happens all the time. And so frequently what I see is commanders expecting the soldier or the service member to give up their BAH and BAS, which is in most cases going to be far more than what the law would require. So simply the best thing in those situations is to file, if it hasn't been filed, and go ahead and get the judge to set a child support amount so that the service member can still protect some of their income.
And in those types of situations, when you have the military define what they think is the correct amount, does a service member get any credit if it's more than what a court puts into place?
Potentially, but not usually. I mean, at least in Texas, judges love child support. So they're just going to say, hey, we appreciate you overpaying. Good for you, right? Like, I mean, your kid's better off. And so, yeah, the service member wouldn't get that back. And interestingly, once you divorce, depending on your rank and where you're living and there's other factors that go into place, you could lose some of that BAH or BAS. So it could be something a benefit that is awarded to you in its maximum amount while you're married and maybe your spouse is living with you. So that can also be an issue when we're calculating child support, we almost need to figure out what it will be post-divorce. So that it's important for us to get numbers from the military to say, hey, when this person divorces, what is their BAH and BAS going to look like, so we can better determine what their gross or net income will be.
So your advice should be talk to an attorney sooner rather than later in these types of situations.
Yes, we can protect so many things the quicker, and also we can get those provisions we talked about for visitation on temporary orders also. So the sooner we get into court, the sooner we can make sure that the service member has a deployment coming up in a week, and their wife decides to, or husband decides to leave and go back home, right? We can file into the case immediately and protect that service member's family's ability to still maintain a relationship with the child, even if they're deploying in a week. So it's so imperative that they contact us and get that thing going as quickly as possible.
We get a lot of questions as well when it's dealing with health insurance and health care. Can you maybe walk our listeners through what is TRICARE and who qualifies for that?
Yeah. So active service members and retired service members. And TRICARE is essentially a zero deductible PPO plan in a sense. I know that the military has more and more recently started working with out of network providers for retired military members and stuff, and people who were living outside of the scope of the military base to be able to use providers without affecting their ability to have child or insurance. Once, if a service member does retire, that's something that the children would be able to keep, as long as, and service member would keep until they turn 18 or graduate high school, or until the health insurance laws cut that child off. And then for divorcing spouses, there's a 20-20-20 rule that could protect their TRICARE benefits as well. And essentially what that is if they did 20 years of service, they did 20 years of marriage, and those 15 or 20, it depends on which rule you're using, but either 15 at a minimum, 15 to 20 years of your marriage overlaps your military service, then the spouse can still qualify for TRICARE even after the divorce.
And if the length of the marriage does not overlap, then they do not qualify, or is there a period of time where they do?
Well, so that would be the 20-20-15 rule as an example. But pretty much if you have not been married to the service member for 15 years of their service, you're probably going to be unlikely to qualify for TRICARE at least. That's kind of like the magic number for the military. But as long as you have that, you would have the ability to receive TRICARE for the rest of your life, even though you're a divorced spouse.
Yeah, when you were talking about that rule, there's also another rule, the 10-10 rule. Can you maybe elaborate on what that is, especially for those who are maybe new practitioners to the military side of family law, and those who are potentially even going through a separation, divorce, or contemplating it?
Yeah, so I think you're referencing the ability to receive payments from a military retirement. And so, yeah, essentially what that means is as long as you've been married for 10 years, the DCAS, the Department, oh man, I can't, the acronym, it's the financial wing of the United States military. They will actually pay the divorced spouse directly as long as you have 10 years of service without having to go through and contact that military member to receive the money. So they can actually receive an account and get direct payments from the military for their portion of whatever pension that may be awarded or allowed to have.
That's the biggest misnomer that I hear all the time is, oh, well, they don't qualify because it hasn't been 10 years. Well, it's just 10 years. It really applies to the DFAS side of it. It doesn't eliminate.
Exactly. For the direct payments, right? They still qualify. You can still pay it. They're just not going to get it directly from DFAS, which does make it easier, right? Because once you're divorced, I mean, rightfully so, service members feel like it's their retirement, right? They did the work. They did the blood, sweat, and tears. They were in the field. They did the deployments. And I want to make it clear that it's important not to discount spouses, right? Because meanwhile, you're doing all of that. They're holding down everything, taking care of your kids, making sure they're at school, feeding, washing, all of those things. So it is what it is. But the point is, military members feel very protective over their pensions. And so having to kind of work with the military member, and maybe they're remarried or they have new children, whatever, 15 years in the future after your divorce, I can understand where that's not very fun for either person involved. So being able to go directly to DFAS to work through that is for sure an advantage.
As we are on Veterans Day and Veterans Week, how can family law attorneys advocate for veterans in court?
Yeah, so I think luckily for us, there's already an honor and a tradition with being in the military and serving. I think judges, at least in Texas, are already going to feel like the military member is awarded some difference, right? And they're going to understand to a degree their plight. So I think as attorneys, it's important to not oversaturate that, but still make sure that the court understands the sacrifices that the client is going through, and thereby those sacrifices is making it difficult for them to maintain the marriage, visit with their children, have any real control over certain aspects of their life from a marriage or from a custody perspective. And I think once we see that and we make that clear to the court, and we let them know that our client is interested essentially in having as much time as they can with their children, and open to letting their wife have whatever she's whatever she's allowed to have, or whatever she's afforded under the law, then judges understand the unique situation of it. And so I think that becomes the most helpful. And also being informative to opposing counsels. And like we talked about in the beginning, being able to communicate with your clients and let them know that we understand, especially for me, that I understand what they're going through. I went through essentially exactly the same thing. And it ended up being one of the best things that ever happened to me. So it doesn't have to be a negative experience. And we can make this work in such a way that you can have a great life post-divorce.
What are some lessons you've learned from both serving in the military and advocating for your clients?
So through my service, I would say the biggest lesson I learned is just how important spouses can be to service members emotionally, especially emotionally, because when we deploy, we're very reliant on our family life being without drama, right? It's hard for divorce, that whomever is handling stuff is handling things. There's enough stress in a deployment that calling your wife or your husband and finding out that there's been an affair, or that your children are sick, or that she's not coming or he's not coming home on time, or all the things that we hear, it introduces another level of stress that a lot of times we're not suited to handle, right? We're not prepared for that. And so I think that can be very, very difficult for us. And so understanding how important that is and trying to manage that was huge. Secondly, when advocating for clients, letting them understand that they have rights. Just because they're in the military, just because they're traveling, just because they may not be able to be primary parent and provide this stable environment that's going to be in this county, at this school forever, doesn't mean that that's not the only option. There's lots of kids in the military that travel whenever parents travel. They have schools on military bases where all those children do are be military brats in a sense, right? So they're all used to traveling, and frankly, they see each other sometimes in the same vehicles. When you go outside of the bases, those schools, those counties that are known as military communities, they're so used to that children are coming and going. Those teachers are used to it. Those principals. There's going to be so many transition services that it gives children a skill, I think, to be able to quickly adapt to multiple environments. So allowing the service member to understand, hey, we're here for you. There is life beyond divorce, right? And you can have it, and that doesn't necessarily have to affect your service. You don't have to retire. You don't have to just hop out of the military and give up your pension and all these other things. There's so many ways you can still navigate this process and let you finish your service obligation.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And unfortunately, we're out of time, and I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface
Yeah,
on
we just scratched
all we
it.
need to talk about and what we can discuss. But I want to thank you for your time today and coming back on again as a guest. And also, again, I really appreciate your service to our country. And for those tuning in, happy Veterans Day. Thank you for all those who serve our country. It's greatly appreciated. And we know that there's a lot of sacrifice that goes into that. For those who are going through a divorce or a separation or even contemplating it, give Melone Hatley an opportunity to speak with you, reach out to us. We're more than happy to kind of walk you through what your risks are, what your options are. And if it gets to that point, we'll be here to help you through this process. Again, thank you to all in the military. This is Melone Hatley's podcast. I now pronounce you divorced. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and rate. We do appreciate all these 5-star ratings that are coming through. So thank you.
Thank you. Happy Veterans Day to all the veterans that are listening.